Hello everyone, and it gives me a great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor Christopher Whatley, who's the Emeritus Professor of Scottish History at the University of Dundee and a Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. He has very strong island connections and interests and is currently involved in a series of Royal Society of Edinburgh events called Islands Past, Present and Future. And the future one will be in Orkney very soon, so look out for that one. Chris is a renowned expert in Scotland's history from the 17th century to the present day, and no doubt on either end of that as well. And Scotland's relationship with England and the rest of the UK has been a particular research interest of his and resulted in a wonderful award-winning book, The Scots and the Union. However, it's a rather different book that Chris is going to talk about today in this Islands Matter webinar, where we explore a whole range of different island disciplines, matters, issues, and literatures. And today we're going to hear about the island of Pabay and his wonderful book, Pabay, an Island Odyssey, that has been described as an island history almost without comparison, one of the finest Highland books of the 21st century. And Chris himself says the book is autobiographical, biographical, and historical. And it's an attempt to place and understand my own and my family's experience of living and working on what is a small inner Hebridean island off Skye within the longer history of the place. What's a single case study underlines the uniqueness of Pabay's story, while also confirming common features of Scotland's islands histories, small islands in particular. It's to be hoped that the discussion following the introductory talk will focus on these issues. Indeed, I hope it will. So, welcome, Chris. It's great to have you with us. I'll run the PowerPoint for you. So just tell me when you want me to change the slide. I'd be more than happy to do that. And people will be adding questions in the chat. So everyone out there, please add your questions to the chat, and we can pick those up and discuss with Chris afterwards. So, hello, Chris.
Hi, Andrew. That's a very kind and generous introduction. Could we maybe start the show, so to speak, so I can
Yes,
I can see what I'm
absolutely.
talking about.
There we go.
Right. Okay. So we can move on to the next one, please, because that is going to explain. Yes, I should begin by explaining why I have written this book and why I'm interested in this particular island. And there are two very, very different inspirations, if you like. One is the personal one. That is that my late aunt, who you can see in the picture there, my late Aunt Margaret, she lived on Pabay for a long time, and I'll explain the circumstances later on. But she lived on Pabay for a long time. She was taken there, well, not taken there. She went there with my uncle when she was relatively young, a young mother of two children who had been brought up in the English Midlands, and then found herself on a little island off the Isle of Skye and lived there for 20 years or so, for much really then of her formative adult life. When she left the island, she had learned a lot on the island about how to survive and how to make a bit of a living, and knitting was something which she did a lot of. So when she moved from Pabay to the island of Skye in the early 1970s, she worked in this little croft house there. That was her where she made and sold woolen garments. And I used to go and see her, and she would sit and talk to me about her life on Pabay. And before she died, she asked me, because she knew I was a historian, if I could write her life story. And I said I would, but at that time I was fully employed, and I had to write things for the RAE or the Ref, and my auntie's story wouldn't really fit in with that high pressure academic kind of environment. So sadly she died, but after she died, I reflected in terms of what I'd promised her I would do, which I said I would write her story at some stage. But as I was then becoming interested in islands generally, I thought what I could do is fit her tale within the longer story of the island of Pabay. And so that's one inspiration for this book. It was basically keeping a promise that I'd made to my aunt, who had lived much of her life on the island. So could I have the next picture, please, Andrew? But because I'm an academic, I had to go about this. I didn't have to, but I thought I should go about this project with an academic concept, if you like, in mind. And so I just, on the screen there is a quotation from Michael Anderson's great book on Scottish population from the 1850s to today. And he wrote there that people who lived on the Scottish Islands experienced pressures that encouraged not merely central places within islands, but also widespread population declines, including the total desertion of many islands with small populations and limited arable land and transport accessibility. There were, however, important differences in underlying economies and accessibility between different islands, which produced great diversity of demographic outcomes. And so that, if you like, is the context in which I began to explore Pabay's history over time. So could we have the next one, Andrew, please? And so Pabay, for those of you who don't know, there's more than one Pabay in the Scotland's islands, if you like, amongst Scotland's islands. But the one I'm talking about is off the end of Skye. It's down near Broadford there. It's in the Sound between Applecross and Rasay and Skye itself. And it sits there, as you'll see in the picture on the left, very much in the centre of Broadford Bay. So in part it provides a shelter for Broadford, but it's also in a very significant strategic location, which you folks who are serious students of islands will be aware of, and well, not only islands, but of the north and the connections between Scotland and Scandinavia. And you will know that sound is on the routeway, or one of the routes from the Scandinavian countries where so-called Vikings, travelled south through the Sound, past Kyle, and down into the southern islands, and eventually to the Isle of Man, Ireland, and indeed further afield. And so Pabay from an early stage was a significant place. It was, I think, a stopping off place for Scandinavians, raiders and settlers, certainly for raiders, and I think probably was used as a place to refuel foodstuffs and so forth. But I'll probably come back to that. So there's where Pabay is. Could I have the next one, please, Andrew? So it's a low-lying island, as you can see. That's a picture of it taken from Ben na Cailleach, which is the mountain that looms over Pabay. But you'll see there very clearly the strategic location of Pabay in the Sound. On the picture on the right just is another picture of the island, and it's low-lying, and that is so crucial when it comes to understanding some of the problems experienced by people over time, not just my family, but people over time living on that island, or trying to make a living on that island. So let's move on, Andrew, to the next one, please. And as everybody knows, but it's worth reinforcing the point, Scotland's islands are very, very different. There's some 800 of them, and you'll know exactly the number, I guess, but they are different. And here's Scalpay, which is the island next to Pabay, and you'll see there that while Pabay is low-lying, very exposed, Scalpay, which is slightly bigger, or significantly bigger than Pabay, but it's also a small island. There's actually a tree-lined avenue there on the left up to the big house. There were no trees of that size on Pabay; they wouldn't grow, and there wasn't that sort of shelter, that sort of almost idyllic situation that the house in Scalpay's on. And you'll see there the house nestled beneath the main hill or mountain on Scalpay. So, and there's one more, Andrew, of these kind of pictures of islands. And there's another, that's some rocks off the north of Skye. They're unlike Pabay because they're completely rocky. Nothing grows on them, or little grows on them. And they are peopled by, or they're basically bird colonies, and that's Lord MacDonald's tables. I won't try and pronounce the Gaelic name, but there we are. So islands are very, very different, and I perhaps should have taken these out of this presentation because I think you will know that better than I do. But let's move on to the next one, if we may. So Pabay, as I'll make clear in the next few minutes, has appeared in, it's a significant part of Scotland's history, but perhaps it's best known for its geology. It was low-lying, and people like the famous Hugh Miller, the geologist, went there, discovered it, so to speak. He wasn't the first to discover it. It had been discovered 20 or 30 years before as a place of geological significance. And he said there, as you can see in the quotation, that the petrification of its shores would fill a museum. Miller wanted to buy Pabay, actually, or I'm not sure he seriously wanted to buy Pabay, but he certainly thought it was a wonderful place because these petrifications rise by thousands and tens of thousands on the exposed places of seawall strata, standing out in bold relief like sculpturings on ancient tombstones, at once mummies and monuments, the dead, and the carved memorials of the dead. Every rock is a tablet of hieroglyphics with an ascertained alphabet, every rolled pebble a casket with old pictorial records locked up within. And I came to this to the serious study of Pabay, in later life, so to speak. But when I was a boy, I spent, many years on Pabay, and one of the great things about being a boy there was the fossils, which you could collect in huge quantities. I now understand the significance of some of these fossils, but at the time they were just kind of things you collected and so on. But it was discovered, as I say, in the 19th century, and I think virtually every significant Scottish or British geologist in the 19th century spent some time on Pabay. And the next one, please, Andrew, which is Geekie, who is one of the more eminent geologists of the 19th century. He said of Pabay it was the most interesting square mile among the Western Isles, and it is certainly the case. It's still much visited by students of geology, and it was very useful that they continued to do so during my own family's time there, because my auntie, who never lost the opportunity of making a bob or two, would make scones and cakes and so forth for these geology students who were on Pabay for the day, and earn a shilling or two from their custom. So let's move on. I mean, the reason, by the way, Geekie was called the lad of the stones was that when he went to Pabay, and he was a student of Miller, really. Miller recommended that he went to Pabay in the 1840s, and he did so and stayed for a while. And there was only one family left on the island at the time, and they could not understand why this young man would spend his days filling a sack or a crate with stones, which they thought were just 10 a penny, so to speak, and of no consequence. And he was accorded the name the lad of the stones. So this is more that. So that's what put that aspect of Pabay is what put it on the map. But this is an early 19th century drawing of Pabay, and the point I want to make here is that Pabay was a very, very difficult island to work. It was through all time, as far as I can make out anyway, certainly from medieval times onwards. But nevertheless, there was considerable optimism about what you could do with Pabay, which you can see here in the early 19th century. I'll explain what this map's about in a minute. But it went on to the same story, if you like, of optimism and opportunity, was told on several occasions by people who visited the place, who thought they would farm the place in the 19th century, the 20th century. My own uncle, when he first landed on Pabay, just after the Second World War, was hugely excited with what he saw, but experience taught him that the first impressions are not necessarily those which are the most accurate, if you like. So this is probably a map drawn by Blackadder, who was a land surveyor, and Pabay at this time was part of the MacDonald estate, the MacDonalds of Armadale in the south of Skye. And they were in the business, as so many landowners at the time were, in terms of trying to reform their estates, to commercialise, and to use the land in a more productive fashion. I say productive in inverted commas because I know there are issues about clearance and sheep and so on and so forth. Anyway, to cut a long story short, Blackadder surveyed the MacDonald estates on Skye, which included Pabay, and actually said that Strath, which is the parish of which Pabay is part, was likely to be the most productive part of the MacDonald lands, if you like. And he was particularly excited with Pabay, and he visited it and you'll see there on that map, I hope you can see on the map anyway, that there are areas to the north and to the south which are described as being arable. There's a huge area in the middle which is described as being improvable. You'll already see there that there are some lines on the island which are really ditches or ditches, or which were used to drain the island, and it continually had to be drained. I pointed out earlier on how low lying it was, and that was a challenge through all time actually for Pabay, because it was so low lying, it was so wet that it had to be drained in order to be cultivable. But keeping those drains clear was a huge task over a couple of centuries actually, and it was very difficult to keep them operational, if you like. But anyway, that the map is designed to demonstrate that the optimism there was about Pabay. It was considered that it could be one of the most fertile parts of the MacDonald estates. As we'll see, it wasn't always the case. So let's move to the next one, Andrew, please. Okay, I'm going to cut a long story short here. Pabay was probably first visited by people who collected shellfish on the shore and so forth, and there is evidence of early occupation. That is well before the BC or in early times. It was then, we think, there was some Christian settlement there, and almost certainly it was a place inhabited by eremites and holy men, if you like, holy men or holy women, holy people. There are some early religious structures on the island which are very hard to interpret and have never really been investigated by archaeologists, scholars, and so forth. So the island, it was at one time in the lands of the McKinnon family. It was then, as I say, in the 19th century, became part of MacDonald estates. And here we have two sets of owners in the 19th and early 20th century. On the left, Sir Donald Curry bought the island in 1895 from the MacDonald clan, or from Lord MacDonald, and wanted it really, as so many of these lowland businessmen who had money to spare, wanted it as a hunting island, if you like, as part of Scalpe Estate. So he bought Scalpe, and he bought the other two islands nearby, Guillemont and Longueuil, as well as Pabay, and he wanted Scalpe for deer hunting or deer forestry, if you like, and Pabay for snipe and small birds and some fishing. He was succeeded, Sir Donald Currie, by the Sir Henry Bell. He was a man who was very much involved in bringing over meat from Argentina. He was very much involved in the forefront of refrigerated ships, and he succeeded Sir Donald Currie. So that's very much typical of the Western Islands. You know, you have rich men, families in the 19th century coming over, taking over the islands and turning them into places for shooting and fishing and leisure. So, but before that, and I hope I'm not confusing you, but before that, Pabay was, in the early 19th century, inhabited by 4, at the maximum 5 families. There were 4 or 5 households there in 1841. By 1851, there was only 1. And that is almost certainly the result of the potato famine and the island being left or deserted, if you like, except for 1 family. And from that time onwards, until the 20th century, only 1 family or less lived on the island. And so in the 19th century, after the 1840s, there was a family there. They were the man and woman and their children who entertained Miller and Geekie, but they were there basically to look after the island, to do some. It was used basically for some sheep, for some cattle, and as really a live larder for the MacDonalds in Armadale. So whenever they were having guests, they would order a cattle from Pabay. A cow, sorry, from Pabay for the dinner table, so to speak, and that was how it was. For a long time, Sir Donald Currie did do some important work on Pabay. He wasn't a scoundrel altogether, because he did build some very fine a very fine cottage and farm buildings on the island. He built the jetty, which is still there. The farm buildings were still there. In fact, when my uncle went to Pabay, as I say, just after the Second World War, he was amazed at the substantial nature of the barn and the farmyard there. And as I say, that goes back to Sir Donald Currie at the turn of the 20th century. So by the Henry Bell, as I say, in 1931 leaves, and the island then fell into another family's care or ownership, and they simply kept the island on by employing 2 brothers who lived on the island until the Second World War. They were there basically as keepers and very, very small farmers, but basically their job was to keep the place habitable, and to keep and to make it ready if the owners then wanted to go shooting or whatever. But the island was deserted in the Second World War because one of the brothers was offered the job of as farm manager on Scalpe, and the other brother was unable to stay on the island himself because he couldn't operate the boat. You needed 2 men to operate a boat on Pabay. I'll come back to the problems of the navigating in Pabay's waters later on. So by the time my family came along in the end of just after the end of the Second World War, it was deserted. So could we next picture, please? No, I wanted to. I share. This is fine. This is a sort of wealth which Sir Donald Currie had. This is the Isle Air, which was the boat which he used to, well, he sailed in the waters around Scalpay and Pabay down to Kyle, but also used this in the Mediterranean. But that will contrast with a picture I'll show you later on of the sort of boats my folks were using to make the crossing between Broadford and Pabay. So move to the next one, please. Okay, here's when my own family move in, so to speak. As I say, I should give you a little bit of indication of their background. My uncle, who's the man on the right there, came from the English Midlands. He had during the Second World War, he'd worked on the land and had become interested in agriculture. After just at the end of the Second World War, beginning of peacetime, he rented a farm near Birmingham, but it was small, it was run down, and he didn't have the capital. He didn't have any money to invest in what to engage in the investment that would be required to make that a success. And anyway, the farmland was being encroached upon by house building and so forth. So he and my aunt came to Skye for a holiday of some sort at the end of the 1940s and saw Pabay, went to visit Pabay and loved it. And I suspect partly because it was low-lying and it seemed green and fertile, it reminded him of Warwickshire. And he had read some books at the time about a dentist in Wales who had gone and taken over an island off the coast of Wales. I think that's one of the inspirations. So he came to Skye in 1949-50. He had the only experience he had of boating prior to this was pushing a punt near Stratford-on-Avon. So he had to learn a lot about the sea, and that sea crossing can be a difficult one, as I know from my own experience. So he had no experience of the sea, and yet, of course, the sea is the lifeline in terms of contact between the islands and the mainland. My aunt hated the sea, but she nevertheless sold it for him. They came to, that's a picture of her on the boat as they came. They'd got the train from Birmingham to Kyle. They'd sailed up from Kyle to Broadford. She felt very disoriented because folks were talking Gaelic, and she had none whatsoever, as you might imagine. And she had two little children. And they, as I say, they acquired the island. They never ever owned the island because they never had the money so to do. But he managed through various means to borrow money. My uncle did, that is, in order to mortgage the place. So they came there with high hopes. And I said earlier talked earlier about the promise of the island. He had taken a spade or had access to a spade on the only visit that he and my aunt made to Pabay, and had dug deep or dug into the soil there and liked what he felt. So he felt this could work. And of course, he'd gone a very fine time of year. I've seen postcards that he was writing to my folks in Glasgow, and these were wonderful autumnal evenings wonderful autumnal evenings and days that he was spending on Skye, and of course Pabay looked promising. Next picture, please. Yeah, and there is Pabay as it was when they arrived. Really, it was it's low-lying, always very bleak. There wasn't much growth on the island, certainly in terms of trees. And there was this was the road from the jetty, which had been built by Sir Donald Currie. going up to a little house where you'll see in the distance, or just before, it's marked in white there on the picture, and just to authenticate my own understanding of this place on a first-hand basis. That's me on the right-hand side amongst with my other two cousins. So I think I was 3 at the time. So next picture, please. So my uncle then had the job of turning this island, which had been deserted for 7 years, which hadn't been productively farmed for a long time, perhaps since the 1840s, and embarked on a whole host of farming operations, if you like. But there, and there's some pictures of various works being carried out. I mean, what's interesting, what I find interesting now is he was using, age-old methods, if you like, by taking, for example, seaweed, kelp, and mixing that with shells as a fertilizer. He had borrowed money for a tractor, but this is where some of the promise became a little bit disappointing. When my aunt had an uncle had spent the day or half a day on Pabay, just looking at the place, they hadn't seen what was to be their first major challenge, and believe it or not, that was rabbits. Because my folks didn't have any money, and they therefore had to very quickly. They arrived in January, and very quickly had to put in some seed for a crop. So what he did was put in potatoes in such land as was plantable, so to speak. But then went to harvest those potatoes in August, September of 1950, and found they had been eaten by rabbits. He'd been told that rabbits don't eat potatoes, but they did on Pabay. And that was an eye opener, because that left them with no means of sustaining themselves, and so that drove him and my aunt to the seashore and to whelks, and filling bags of whelks, or filling them, working in the most horrendous conditions. I don't know if any of you've been whelking, but it's cold and it's wet and it's sore on your hands because your skin is cut, and then of course the salt water gets into. It's not a fun thing to do. So they hung on in there, and eventually did manage to do some productive farming, but never as much as they had wanted to do, because the conditions are enormously difficult. He got very excited, perhaps 2 or 3 years after he'd been there, because he had managed to grow some wheat. But as Thomas Pennant had discovered way back in the 1770s, if that the wind in August, September can be very, very strong and can flatten a promising harvest just like that. And that's the sort of thing that happened to him. In fact, if I had been a historian when my uncle embarked on this project, I would have said to him, take heed, read some of these earlier travelers' accounts, and be aware that this is no easy challenge. So next picture, please. But my uncle was a hugely resourceful individual, and recognized that wheat wasn't going to grow, oats were going to be difficult, that rabbits were continued to be a major challenge until tuberculosis came along. My cousin and I, my cousin and I, were sent out at every possible occasion with air guns and snares to try and keep the rabbits at bay, but we failed miserably. It took myxomatosis to deal with them. I could tell you some horrendous stories about that, but I won't. But my uncle recognized that the island could be was in a very useful place for other sorts of enterprises, if you like. And so what he did was he started to breed chickens and build up a fair business doing this from Pabay. That is raising chickens and then selling them right, through Skye and out to the outer isles. And in return, he would take pullets, old hens, and then sell them on to the hotels and restaurants and so forth, such as there were in Skye and the outer isles at the time. And that was a relatively successful business for a short time. But there are various reasons why that didn't really work. One of them being the difficulty of transport, that you're on a little island, you have small boats, and you cannot always guarantee to get these chickens off the island in time for their in time to satisfy customers. So let's move on, please, to the next one. Yeah, this is a kind of a side really, but Pabay was Sir Donald Currie, who I talked about 10 minutes ago, not only built some of the buildings on Pabay, but he also put in these shelter belts in order to try and break the wind, if you like. And this is what was left of those shelter belts when my folks arrived there, and they never managed. My uncle tried to replant these shelter belts in order to make in order to break the wind and make farming much more amenable, if you like, or productive. But the wind from the wind beat him. Next one, please. Okay, I said that I alluded earlier to the problems of Pabay, Pabay's or navigating round about Pabay. There's a map from 1776 showing Pabay, and you'll see there very distinctively some very distinct markings around the island, and those were very prominent, but not always prominent because they were under the sea, but very prominent on the map, reefs. And that meant that Pabay was an enormously difficult place to land at, certainly before the era of motorboats, but even with motorboats it could be difficult. And it was one of the reasons, I haven't said this yet, but one of the reasons why in the 16th and 17th centuries, accounts of Pabay talk about it, a place being, if you like, a nest of robbers. And I think and it was at the time heavily treed. Trees were growing on the island at that time. And I think what was going on here was that the island was inhabited by folks, by marauders basically, who would come out from Pabay in their boats, seize passing merchant boats, if you like, and then scurry back or into the island where they cannot be easily followed because of the nature of the rocky surrounds. And indeed, I know to my cost how difficult it was to get round the island of Pabay. If the tide wasn't right, that is, you had to go for miles. You had to go. The island is only 3 miles round in circumference, but in order to go around it without going aground on one of these reefs, you have to maybe go 7 or 10 miles. And if you're rowing, that's a long row. Okay, next item, please. Next picture, please. And here's one of the challenges my uncle faced. That's the jetty which Sir Donald Currie had built in the 1890s, turn of the 20th century, and it was a nice solid structure, but it was useless in terms of protecting vessels, anything moored there, tied up there, if the wind was coming from the south or the east. And as you probably know, certainly in January, the winds from the east are strong gale. In fact, it's often a period of gales. So just to talk a bit about boats and Pabay. My uncle, as I say, had no experience of boats, but neither did he have much money. but nevertheless had to have a boat, or if not more than one boat. So, but when he arrived on Skye in 1949-50, there were no boats to be had. There'd been a serious gale that winter, and it meant that there was nothing that he could afford available. So he bought from Otto Swire's wife, Otto Swire, the folklorist, if you like. He bought from Otto Swire's husband, this boat, which at the time had been up in Arbost, but it had been waterlogged. But he took this boat, which is called the Sea Otter, drained it, tried to restore it, put an engine in it, and got it going. And that was a remarkable thing. That was the boat I first arrived on Pabay in. But this is in 1951-2. So could we have the next picture, please? And there's the boat a year later. And beside it, there's another dinghy. It was called the Shearwater. So the first two boats that my uncle bought were wrecked very, very because there was no shelter from those southern and easterly gales. And during his time on Skye, in fact, he lost 14 boats, and that was a problem, because he couldn't afford the sort of boat you would need in order to be safe, if you like, and secure. They were hard to handle. They weren't always well built. They were past their best. But the real difficulty was that periodically they would be stranded on the island and left without much food, and indeed there were times too when you couldn't get, say for example, those chicks off the island. And so, but it's a big problem. I mean, it's the problem or a challenge for islands everywhere, big or small, and reliable transport. As I know it's not so much of a problem in Orkney, but certainly in the Western Isles for the past 2 or 3 years, it's been a major controversial aspect of island life. That is the unreliability of the ferries. But it's an issue for all islands. Next one, please. So my folks had to leave Pabay after 20 years or so, and the reason being that my uncle was he had put his heart and soul into the island, but he was injured. He'd had a heart attack. He had 2 heart attacks, in fact, and my aunt decided enough was enough. And that takes us to this issue that I raised at the beginning about the depopulation of small islands. In order for the island economy, if you like, to work, he needed more help, more labor than he could, in order to carry out all the jobs that needed done to successfully farm the island. But you could not afford to take on another family whose labor you ideally need in order to make the island pay. And so basically he didn't ever make money from farming Pabay, notwithstanding his hopes of so doing. The story is not a sad one though, because what happened to him, I'll say this in a sentence or two, is he, one time when he was clearing the ditches that I talked about, discovered a little seam of clay, and he thought he'd teach his kids, my cousins, what you could do with clay. And he started basically developed an interest in potting, making pots, and ultimately when the family left Skye, they set up a pottery in the north of the island called Edinburgh Pottery, where my uncle worked until he died, and that pottery is still going strong. And so my family are now firmly ensconced in Edinburgh and indeed the rest of Skye, because of course my cousin has had children and they've had children, and so the inasmuch as the government, the post-war governments, Labour and Conservative, were determined or keen to stop the outflow of folks from the islands. In my family's case, it worked, because while they left Pabay, they have still remained on Skye, and there's many more Whatleys on Pabay, on Skye now, than there were in 1949 when there were none. But when they sold the island, they sold it to another couple who tried to make a living from it. They tried to, they bred a particular sort of sheep and worked it for about 10 years. After they sold it, it was taken, it's ultimately now in the hands of an individual who's a builder from down south of the border, and he has tried to reforest the island, rewood the island, which is how it was in the 15th, 16th centuries. But it's not been a huge success. In fact, in some ways you could describe it as a disaster because he's not, I'm not condemning him, but this man doesn't live on the island. He has restored the farm buildings and built a house there, but he only visits, or he and his family only visit it for a week at a time, a year, sorry. And so the island is no longer productive in that sense. So if I could have the next slide, please. So all of the endeavour that my folks put into that island in terms of, including fencing and ditching and so forth, hardly a trace of it is to be seen. There is the field systems have disappeared. The traces of early religion, early men and women of religion have gone. They've been the place is overgrown with rushes and brush and so on and so forth. And so I went back to Pabay probably about 3-4 years ago with one of my nephews, and what we saw was that desolation in a sense, but also some remnants of a boat which my uncle had lovingly restored. And so there's a sort of poignant picture, if you like, of the remains of the boat. And my uncle was a great craftsman. You had to be able to do anything on Skye: build, dig, involve yourself in creating wind turbines for power and so on and so forth. But anyway, this was his last boat that he loved, and lying there near the jetty is the remains of the hull as it collapses, and one of the engines which he loved the sound of. So this is a symbol of beautiful things men can build, but of their fragility too. So the next picture, please. And if I could just kind of end with this, that what endures on Pabay now are the rocks and the fossils. And it's ironic that creatures that swam in Pabay's warmer waters many millions of years ago have left a more secure mark than those human beings who have been there during the past couple of centuries. There's more trace of what Hugh Miller was interested in than of the work that was done by Lord Macdonald's people and those who have worked the island or tried to work the island in the 19th and 20th centuries. The harsh realities of trying not to tame nature, that's futile, but to work with nature in more unforgiving environments can test the most enthusiastic and physically able small island dwellers beyond endurance. And that's my uncle. Self-sufficiency is an admirable aim, but in an island like Pabay, impossible to attain, or has been hitherto. Island living is expensive and fraught with difficulties beyond the comprehension of Britain's increasingly urbanised population. And maybe this is a bit bitter, this last paragraph, but ownership of many of Scotland's most desirable islands has become the privilege of those with surplus capital invest and who seek not to subsist on them, but rather to gain the less tangible rewards of island ownership that include having a unique holiday getaway and to avoid wintering there. So it's for my family and for people like myself who were there for long periods of time, it was a wonderful experience. It was a magical experience, and for all the difficulties my uncle and his wife and children faced, it's left an indelible mark on all of us. But as a proposition for living a sustainable life, it's not on, or certainly doesn't seem to be. And I think that's the story of many of these small islands. As I said at the very beginning, it's the small islands that have become uninhabited in the last 100 and 150 years. And the islands that seem to be thriving and surviving are those where there is, if you like, critical mass and that are more capable of sustaining decent-sized populations. I think I'll stop there. Thanks very much for listening. If that was a bit disjointed, it's because it was, but I've tried my best to cover several thousands of years of history, actually, but and to make it interesting. But
you certainly did that, Chris. That was wonderful. Really fascinating account of decades of heroic effort, and also the background to the island as well, and providing an example of the case that we have to remember that islands, you need a minimum number of people on them to make them viable, not just a kind of a maximum number that can be supported. You actually need a minimum number for it to work.
Yeah.
And also for providing a sort of interesting example of something that's happening a lot more in the Scottish Islands, and that's this sort of change of population from, say, what you may call the indigenous population, and then through political and economic reasons, a replacement, new people coming in, and doing their thing, and of course that can have positive and negative results. But just fascinating, this attempt to sort of revive an island community. So we have quite a number of different people putting in their questions there in the chat. So I'll go through some of these for you. I was just wondering, in the heyday of the Curries, did they have much to do with the Bullocks on rum? Were there big parties somewhere in the sort of...
Well, there actually were. They used to gather, apparently, the owners of the western, so many of these western islands, in those big boats that I showed you, the Isle Air I showed you. But those were not 10 a penny, but they used to collect every summer down at Kyle, where there's the so-called King Haakon Bay, but down there there's a large deep water bay where apparently they used to meet, and you go from boat to boat and no doubt enjoy champagne and other goodies. But yes, so I don't know if specifically he met with the Bullocks, but certainly he did meet with others who had similar craft. And in fact, Curry was a hugely well connected individual. He was a friend of Gladstone. I think Gladstone sailed on his Isle Air. It's not the Isle Air that sunk off Stornoway, but another craft of that name.
Fascinating. Well, there's some comments as well in the chat. I don't know if you can see the chat, but I'll just read them out.
I do, because I saw them, but I couldn't read them at the same time.
No. So Lynn, who's based in Orkney and member of INS, she's pointing out that there are many parallels to Cava in Orkney, where two ladies lived and worked for decades until, as she says, decrepitude forced abandonment. So we can find many examples of this having taking place. Julia is saying, well, I think you answered this, that do you think that your uncle could have succeeded if you'd had more money and more help? Well, I think that was one of your main points, wasn't it? That was the case.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Well, the successor to my uncle had a bit more money, and actually he was able to do something hugely important. That was blow a hole in that jetty and build a storm storm anchorage, if you like, and that made a difference for them. And they were also able to afford, and not with a huge sum of money, but they had enough to make a difference, so that allowed them to buy a twin-hulled motorboat, which didn't, with a very small draft, if you like, and also with the Storm Harbour, it meant they were so much more secure. Now they had an easier time in that regard. So money is important. Yeah.
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 And well, picking up sort of on that, Deborah, she's wondering if the relationships between Skye and the smaller islands, what was the relationship? Was there a sense of community through language or other commonalities? And how were newcomers like your family sort of received at that time? Were there any sort of support systems across the islands for folk if things went wrong?
That was there's yes and there's positives and negatives there, or yeses and nos. There were some eyebrows raised when my uncle went there initially, because I think they just thought this was crazy. That is locals. And my cousins who had to go to school in Broadford, they did find some difficulties because of the language thing, and the feeling that the feeling that or the feeling of some of the kids at school apparently was that because my folks weren't crofters, they were farmers. They saw themselves as a cut above, but actually they weren't at all. It was just a different way of trying to make a living, and no more successful actually than crofting. However, and also other issues like doctors being unwilling to go out there in rough weather. You can understand that, but these were pre-helicopter, kind of before you had the helicopter health service, and so that was one of the reasons my aunt was so insistent to give up, because after my uncle had his second heart attack, I think it was 3 weeks before they could get anyone out to have a look at him. So that was serious. Having said that, they were able. My aunt did. She was a wonderfully, I don't know, friendly, outgoing, warm personality, and she certainly managed to make her mark within the local community. Over time, my uncle managed to. Well, he was selling his chicks locally. But when he started to make some pots, he was selling some little ashtrays and so forth in a chemist in Kyle. So over time, I think, yes, they were accepted. But like in many small communities, you don't have to be an island community. Newcomers are often, newcomers for 50 years, But so it was a mix. It was a mixed bag. Yeah.
Well, going back a little bit in time, Desiree wondered. We know that the name Pabay is Old Norse, and that you mentioned that the Vikings would have been there.
Yeah.
Are there? I think you mentioned it a little bit, but are there obvious remains, graves, mounds, things that haven't been explained by archaeologists so far?
They're not. It has never been properly investigated, but there are some what looks like, or what we used to think was some sort of Neolithic grave, an area. It's marked on old maps as graveyard. Now this is appalling to have to admit this, but when we were young, we would go digging around there because we didn't know any better. But we didn't ever find anything of significance, but maybe we didn't know what we were looking for. So there is that. There is the remains of a chapel, which is probably 13th, 14th century, very, very small. But never, as far as I know, they're recorded on by the former Royal Commission Ancient Historical Monuments, who went out there and measured things and so forth, but never been investigated in the way that you would like things to be investigated with a proper archaeological kind of survey. But it's very well, and I doubt it will be. But nevertheless, there are old stories, tales, if you like, and I don't dismiss tales of Pabay being somewhere settled by Saint Milrua, who was who was very influential in terms of bringing Christianity to the south of Skye and also to Applecross. And so, of course, Pabay can be seen to be on the way to Applecross, a stepping stone to Applecross. And you can go to where he is alleged to have gone to Applecross at Breckish, and Pabay is very, very close by there, and you can see, you can in your mind's eye make that journey across to Pabay with him, albeit 1,500 years ago or whatever. But so yeah. So I can't do better than that, really.
Well, that's great. It sounds as if it's a virgin territory, just waiting for some archaeological exploration. I'm involved in a project called Norse in the Sea, and we're looking at some Norse sites on the west, looking for beach markets and possible harbourages and anchorages, rather. So that might be one of the places we should consider.
Yeah, very good. Yeah.
So we're just about at the end, but there's there's one question, another question from Julia. So we'll just ask this. We are one of the modules that we teach in our Highlands and Islands literature is travellers and travellers' accounts in the Highlands and Islands. So Julia is doing that. So she was interested in your mention of Hugh Miller. And did you actually travel there? What made him come? If he did go there, what made him come there in the first place?
Well, he was on his cruise with the Betsy. So Pabay was one of the places he stopped off at, and because there's a huge igneous dike on which cuts through Pabay. It's actually probably the reason Pabay is there, because it hasn't been washed away, because all of that stone that contains those fossils are basically a seabed, but millennia old. So he was able to stop Betsy. He was need to bring Betsy near to the dike on the north west side of Pabay, and come ashore and see what he saw. And indeed, when I was doing the book, it was a delight actually to find that ammonites from Pabay were actually held by the National Museum of Scotland. They're not on display, but it indicates their early significance, in terms of writing Scotland's geological story.
Brilliant. Did you get the chance to look at them?
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, just very final point. Do you think that Pabay will ever be repopulated again?
Well, it's a question I ask myself, and it's a great question, and I would hope so. Like many other small Scottish islands, and with what we're doing, your webinar, with IT and the web and better communications, it becomes more possible to make a living, but you don't have to be, you can design things or work on websites and so forth, and do other things on islands which will generate some money. And also, in one sense, it makes them more, easier to live on. One of the problems my folks had was they had no communications. You didn't have phones, they didn't have walkie-talkies. And so in an emergency, what used to happen was she used to hang a sheet out and hope that someone in Broadford would see it. So these are things that add to insecurities, and a lot of people would feel vulnerable in that situation. And of course, there's now machinery which can be more easily transported, which would clear ditches and do some of the work which human beings were having to do even 30, 40 years ago. So it probably becomes easier, but nevertheless, it's still a pretty tough environment, I think.
Yeah, and you've made that case very successfully. So thank you very much indeed for talking to us today. And I hope everyone who has attended and everyone who's watching the recording will go out and buy a copy of this splendid book. I think sort of single island case studies are the way to go. They're fascinating, a fascinating genre, and I hope to see more of those in future. So thank you very much indeed, Chris. I see there's everyone saying thank you,
thank you
in the chat. And with that, I hope to speak to you again soon about other aspects of Scottish Island Futures.
Great. I thoroughly enjoyed speaking to you all, and well, I wish you all the best in the future, and we'll be in touch, Andrew. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. All the best.
Bye.
Bye.